As far as interacting with web applications goes, then forms pervade the web. They're what you interact with when you're buying something, when you're providing details and so forth. So we need to take a little bit of a look at those in this lecture. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. There's a lot that could be covered, and I want to keep the lecture reasonably short and self-contained. So I'm going to show the basics of structuring a form and using HTML to mark up a detailed machine-readable description of your form. In a later lecture, in the next chapter, I'll introduce some more of the details of forms, just to give you a quick flavour of what's achievable. But let's start off with looking at a bit of a digression, something again you'll see very often in websites, and I want to use these to structure my form. So I want to talk about HTML lists in one slide. They're very simple and very easy to introduce. Basically, two types of list structures within HTML: ordered or unordered lists. I've got examples of one of each of these. So use an ordered list when the sequencing of the items in the list matters. So that particular sequence doesn't make sense, at least doesn't make the intended sense unless I have those itemized in the sequence there, presented there. And this sort of thing you'd use for a sequence of operations, actions in a recipe, for example, in a cookery recipe, a series of possibly a temporal series of events, something like that. So use an ordered list for that. In a situation where it really doesn't matter what sequence the items take, then use an unordered list. So here's a typical Saturday morning shopping list where it doesn't matter which order in which you do the purchasing. You would make an ad hoc decision on the basis of convenience of location rather than anything to do with the specific items themselves. So those, when rendered in a browser, look by default somewhat different. Of course, you can alter the styling of these, but the ordered list will by default come out numbered, and the unordered list will come out as just bullet pointed items. So very basic structure, some tags to delimit the element that is the list itself, and then remembering back from that previous slide, each item is a list item and that is an element itself. So there's a nesting of elements within either of those list forms. So a useful structure which we will use again in the final lecture of this chapter when we look at a more elaborate example. So let's look at how to do forms well. Good form in the form business is to follow the guidelines, which I'm going to give you here. So here we've got an entry-level form, very basics. I've got the form tag identifying, wrapping the content of the form element. And in this particular form, I've got two elements within the form. I've got a text area for input in free text, and then I've got what you will invariably have is a submit button, something for the user to press once they've entered all the details. So here's here in fact are two input types. A text area where I've got free text can be entered into it, you'll notice that this particular input element is defined in the usual way, an element in itself, and what I could do is to insert in here some text which is editable. So I might include within between the two tags, delimiting the text area, I could include some text, perhaps from a previous input event, and have the user able to either change that completely or just simply edit some of the free text in there. So at the moment this is going in with an uninstantiated form, so there's no text content in there to provide, just an empty blank text area, but it's got some extra attributes in there. Two attributes I put in there. One is required and one is best practice. So data in forms are always submitted as name value pairs. So if you want the data in that particular input area to be included in the data that's submitted to the server side, then you need to include a name attribute with a value of your choice. So the value in this particular case is going to be the text that's actually entered in the text area, which we'll see in a moment, and that will be associated with the name details. So when someone, the server side, receives the form, then it will look through the form for the parameter name details, and it will extract the value which the user has entered into this text area. I've put another attribute in there which is an ID, and just bear with me for a little while and you'll see the value of that a little bit later in this lecture. So it has a unique ID, and we're going to use that a bit later on. The next input type there is a submit button. So that again has a value associated with it, but the value in this particular case is defined at design time, and that's the label that's going to appear on the button. So I've capitalized submit in this particular case. I could have OK or some other appropriate name there. So let's take a look at how that is shown up. Nothing too dramatic here. The text area, there is a name, some text beside it, and then a submit button. Notice at the moment that's in line. There are no new lines between any of those elements or input types. The other thing to say, which again in an extended example later on in the course we'll come back to, that text area you can also define column and row attributes to specify the respectively the width and height in characters of the text area. If you add in additional text, then the overflow will be hidden, and you will just see the amount which is actually visible, only the amount of text which is visible in the allocated space. So we've started off with absolute minimum of information in there. Let's just add a different type of input field. As I said earlier on, there's a lot of information we could cover in forms. There are a number of different types of input fields. I'll just show you one more for this lecture, and in this particular case we've put a field which is just plain text input type. This is the one to use if you're wanting just relatively small amounts of text, in this particular case just a title. and again I've got a name, an ID. I've also included an initial value for title, and for many input types then specifying the initial value is good practice. In this particular case we don't want to include anything, but you might, in a form in which the form is being used to edit existing data, then the initial value would go in at that point. What will happen now is that when data is entered into the text input field, then when the submit button is pressed, then that short piece of text is going to be associated with the name title in the form that's submitted to the server side. So another input field, and let's take a look at that. And now things are beginning to get a little bit uncomfortable in terms of styling, because as we're adding more input fields, then we're just going to get a long line with no structure to the form at all. So, well, messy is not quite the right word, but we're beginning to lose control a bit, and probably want to start thinking a bit about how this ought to be coherently structured as a form. So this is why I introduced lists to begin with. There's actually two things going on here. Firstly, I've structured the contents of the form as an unordered list. Secondly, for each list item, I've added a label as well as the input type. So there's a label element associated with each input type. This is primarily for accessibility. In the previous example, you'll remember that I did have a piece of text beside the input type, but there was no structured semantics to that. It merely said that here's some text and here's an input type. There's no formal association between the two. What I've done here now is to have a label preceding an input type. They're grouped in the same list item. That's going to help me when it comes to formatting this sensibly. But from the accessibility point of view, what I've got here is a label for details, and then this is why I included the ID in the text area, or in the text input type. The text input type element, so that now the screen reader can identify that the label is for a specific text area identified by a unique identifier. So then we've got something where there is a tight coupling between the label and the text area, and a screen reader or any other user agent can interpret that as intended. So now if we take a look at that, its structure is becoming clearer. This is not styling, it's just marking up the more detailed description of the various elements that go into the form. So the event title and its corresponding input field are grouped together as a list item, and then I've also got this formal coupling that says that event title is a label for the input field which is sitting next to it, and similarly for the event details. Don't worry about the bullet points just now. They clearly aren't what we want for this particular in general, they're not going to be wanted there, and those can be taken out in the styling of that form. So I'm ignoring styling, as I've said several times for the moment, for this course. One final thing, just to provide a little bit more structure. It's perhaps not so essential in this particular example, but what I've done here is to group the list, the unordered list, as a field set, identify that as a field set, and associate with that field set a legend. We're going to see how that looks in a moment, but the real value of this is not so much for this particular example where I've only got a small group of elements in my form, but if you wish to divide your form up into semantically different areas, then use the field sets for each of the clusters of elements. So you can divide up and partition the form and have legends associated with each subcomponent of a complex form. So field set really comes into its own when you've got a complex form with semantically distinct areas which you want to associate a legend with. Again, by default, that even without any CSS styling, most browsers will respect the definition of the field set and draw a box around the elements and include the legend tightly associated with the box as here. As I say, imagine in your mind's eye that we've got various sections within the form, then you will see a number of boxes appear on the form, and that really makes it much easier from a user's point of view, and also from user agent's point of view, screen readers and so forth. Any kind of assistive technology will be able to help the user navigate around the various regions of the form. So now we've got something which has got a clear description of the intended role of various components of the form in detail, and it's ready for styling to be added to that to make it look nice. But from the mechanical agent's point of view, the intention behind all the respective regions of the form is nice and clear now, so set up comfortably for any kind of assistive technology. Now there's just one more thing I want to quickly mention, and that's what happens when the form's submitted. I can't go into the full details of that in this course, because that really depends on the back-end technology which you're using on the server side. So this is just about HTML, so we're not going to get into the details of that. But generally, you will need to add 2 additional attributes to your form tag. One is the action, and the precise syntax that you will use for the action name in that action will depend on the server-side technology you're using. So whether that's a call to a servlet in Java World, call to an action name in Ruby on Rails, or a call to a PHP script, for example, just simply depends on your choice of back-end technology. So you will need that. The other thing that you will need to include is a method name, and this is referring to the HTTP methods which are associated with the HTTP request which is generated. And for a form submission, the form is going to be posting data to the server side, so that will be a post request. Don't worry too much about the details of either of those just now, but if you're looking at other books and references, of course you'll see these 2 attributes mentioned. Please always use post Don't leave it to chance. But in a future course, a more advanced course, we'll go into the details of all of that. But that's just to forewarn you the need to specify what actually happens when you press that submit button. Because without that, it will just throw a blank. It'll just vanish into all the content of your form will just vanish into the ether and never get picked up. And that's wasting time. So, what have we done? I've just introduced the very basics of forms. I've shown you the best practice for semantic markup of a form. You might find some small variants in the literature, but what I've given you, I think, is distilled out best practice from current documentation on the W3C website and elsewhere. There's lots more detail to add, there's more input types, and there are some more HTML features. So forms are getting a lot of support from HTML5, although the implementation of that support in the various browsers is not yet consistent, but both of those things I'll come back to in the next chapter.